So I'd like to now introduce our next speaker. This is our closing keynote. I've been really looking forward to this one. So I'd like to introduce Professor Susan Halford, who's the co-director of the British Digital Future Institute and also the Professor of Sociology. So Professor Halford, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you for inviting me to, to join your conference as part of the wonderful Tommy Flowers network, which drives forward, obviously, a commitment to collaboration between universities and the industry, which you'll see I'm going to give today is a form of collaboration that is really close to my own heart. Just to give you a little bit of background, I'm a geographer by background. I've worked as an organisational sociologist for many years, specialising in questions of organisational change. And for the past 20 years, it seems strange to say, I've worked across the social and computational sciences on questions of digital transformation, initially looking at workplaces and workplace transformation, and then moving more broadly to social questions about digital data, digital methods and infrastructures, now, as was mentioned, as co-director of the Bristol Digital Futures Institute. Now, in the time I have this morning, I'm hoping to be able to bring some of those strands together, that interdisciplinarity, that collaboration across sectors, and the Bristol Digital Futures Institute, by talking about the future. Apologies, my slides are not moving now. Oh, there they go, they're moving with a different mechanism, that's fine. So, by talking about the future. So thinking very much about where we are historically at the moment as we embark on a second year of the global coronavirus pandemic, questions about the future are both very lively and rather urgent. I say lively because in many ways this crisis has caused us to look again at the world around us. If any of you saw Arundhati Roy's article in the Financial Times at the start of the crisis, she said this, she said, historically pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. And this one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. So very lively questions about the kinds of futures that we might be creating as we come out of, we hope, the worst stages of the pandemic. Urgent questions about the futures also because already, the future is not just ahead of us. Already in responses to COVID, some futures are being opened up by the things that we do in response to the pandemic, whilst other futures are being closed down. And my question for today is what part will digital technologies play in these futures in the making? This is perhaps a deceptively simple question. So I'm just getting used to my PowerPoint's behaving oddly. It's a deceptively simple question. After all, all of us are well used to hearing confident claims about how new technologies will shape our future. Most recently, you don't have to dig very far to find some very confident claims for how it is that AI will solve all previously intractable problems, from climate change to global inequality. These quotes here from the websites of just a few of the largest tech companies demonstrate the kind of hyperbolic claims that are made about how AI is going to solve problems and shape our futures. Alternatively, of course, we have the dystopian version of this. AI will lead to the downfall of humanity. The reality, of course, we'll be somewhere in between these two rather extreme binary representations of technology and the future. But these kinds of debates have only heightened in the current COVID crisis as claims about the digital solutions that will enable us to bounce forwards out of the pandemic turbocharge both investment and policy making for digital innovation. So there's a strong commitment that digital technologies will bounce us forwards, and yet we know from history, even from very, very recent history, that the future tends to surprise us. How technologies shape the world depends not only on the technologies themselves, the way they're imagined, what they're supposed to do and not do, and how they're designed, although all of those things are really critical, but it also depends on how these technologies come into use, where, when, by whom, for what, and so on. And in turn, those everyday practices, the use of technologies, shapes, or at least it should shape, the way that we think about creating new technologies. So it's an iterative, cyclical process. Until recently, I worked at the University of Southampton in the Web Science Institute, where I was part of a team of computer scientists and social scientists. Now, web science was a very interesting initiative that was started by eminent computer scientists, including Tim Berners-Lee, who had become really concerned about the way that the web was turning out, which was basically not the way it was supposed to. So whilst Tim had imagined a benign world of information sharing, and probably to his regret is on record as saying that perhaps one day there would be as many as 20 websites in the world, as the web was unleashed, as the possibility of using the web was unleashed on the world, academics, businesses, governments, criminals, even angry young men at Harvard had other ideas about what the web was for. And as the web becomes the central nervous system of our contemporary world, a whole new range of questions arise. What does this do to how we communicate? What does it do to our individual and collective identities, to politics and democracy, to mental health, to social inequality? What does it mean to live our lives this way? And what should we do about it? Even Tim Berners-Lee recognizes this is not a technical question, or at least not solely a technical question. It's also a question of laws, of values, and of commitments to the public good. It's not just the web, of course. Digital technologies, devices, and data are now inextricably woven into the fabric of contemporary societies. So much so that it makes sense to say that the digital and the social are co-evolving. It's that iterative relationship again, co-evolving in a socio-digital world. And we can all think of ways in which that's much for the better, but we can also all think of ways in which that may arguably be much for the worse. So if we're going to focus our attention on the future, and in particular on socio-digital futures, that inextricably bound set of relationships between the social and the technical, then we urgently need to understand how we got here, and we urgently need ways of thinking about what will happen next. In order to do that, and this is coming right back to the Tommy Flowers network, I think we need both interdisciplinarity and we need cross-sectoral collaboration. Interdisciplinarity because the socio-digital world does not fit into the nice, neat silos that structure our education systems, or indeed our organizations. Social scientists, and I'll start with them as a sociologist, have in-depth theoretical and methodological understanding of social relationships, social institutions, everyday practices, and they have a lot of evidence that they've derived from that. But when we as sociologists write about the digital, we're much more comfortable with focusing on the social, economic, and political organization of technology, and we tend to black box the technical details, which of course we're not trained to understand, and we somehow assume that those will follow along behind those social, economic, and political processes. Engineers, on the other hand, of course, know the technical details inside out, and many are not afraid to make very big claims about what those technologies will do or are doing in the world, but are not trained to ground those claims in substantive evidence, rigorous social science method, or systematic theoretical interpretation. Now, I'm generalizing, of course, and many people, I would say not many, actually, some people completely confound those broad stereotypes that I've just represented. But nonetheless, if we take the socio-digital seriously, this argument that the social and the digital are co-evolving with each other, then it's quite urgent that we bridge that gap in knowledge and create new forms of expertise. This needs to be cross-sectoral for at least two reasons. First, because we need to broaden understanding of the socio-digital world across different sites, different actors, different kinds of fields of practice. We need to understand how it seems from government, from industry, from communities. Too often we hear a view that is from somewhere in particular, often a privileged position in research leadership or technology leadership about what we should be doing and why, at the expense of views that come from elsewhere, from the marginalized and from the excluded, or even simply from those who live and work with digital technologies and understand firsthand how things are happening in everyday life, the effects that those technologies have on their lives, their families, their communities, their well-being, and also may hold the key for understanding how things could be done differently. So first, we need to engage communities, industry, government, business, because we need a broader based knowledge and understanding of the socio-digital world. And secondly, because understanding the future, thinking about the future, means thinking about doing innovation differently. Broadening and diversifying our socio-digital imaginaries. How do we think about the future? Where do we think we want to be in the future? We need to disrupt, I would argue, the established narratives about futures that will be, and deliberately open up a broader, more plural range of futures from different perspectives to think about how the future could be rather than will be. For whilst we can't know for sure what the future will hold, we cannot know for sure. That's not possible. We do need to develop collaborative methodologies, evidence bases, and conceptual frameworks to think not only about human futures in the context of rapidly changing technology, which is what we normally do, but also about technology futures in the context of complex, unequal, and fragile societies. So that's the kind of the what and the why. I want to end, or at least continue, by saying something about the how. How do we do all of that? How do we animate that and bring it to life? The first answer is organisational frameworks. As an organisational sociologist, you might not be surprised to hear me say that, but we need to establish organisational frameworks that enable us to transcend those silos and to do that collaborative research, just like the Tommy Flowers Network, just like the Web Science Institute, and now the Bristol Digital Futures Institute, in which BT is a core partner. BDFI, the Bristol Digital Futures Institute, is a university research institute. We have members from, we like to say, philosophy to physics, chemistry to classics, and we have a core membership in the social sciences and engineering. Overall, this is our core aim. Our aim is to pioneer transformative approaches to digital innovation, grounded in in-depth systematic understanding of socio-technical futures to drive the creation of digital technologies for inclusive, prosperous, and sustainable societies. The really important shift there is away from saying, let's study the impact of technologies once they have been created and put into the world, to thinking, let's bring the social and the technical together in the process of technology creation. And that's easy to say. There's a lot of people who are interested in doing it. It's harder to do. Ecosystem which cuts across industry, government, SMEs, and community organisations. And we will be bringing all of those partners together, I hope very, very much physically together in the same co-located spaces for innovative and collaborative working as part of the new Temple Quarter campus, which I believe BT has a new building very close to in Bristol. So that's the organisational how do we do that? And that's really, really important. But of course, the more practical answer to that question of how is simply to get on with doing some research. So I'd like to tell you about a research project that I'm working on with one of our partner organisations, which is LV Insurance, a name that may be familiar to you. You may be less aware that LV is also one of the pioneers in the application of machine learning models in the insurance sector. And our project together with BDFI and LV is focusing on the question of explainable AI. Now, we're starting with the well-understood meaning of that term, i.e. explaining the data and the models and what happens when they come together. But in the spirit I've just outlined above, we're broadening out the concept of explainability in two key ways. The first is that we take an organisational perspective. We don't just start with the models and the data as the focus of our inquiry, but we ask questions about what is machine learning for? What is it supposed to do? Well, how is it imagined to change the way that the organisation works and the organisation's responsibilities and accountabilities? So in short, as the slide shows, we're looking at how human decision makers shape and act on data analytics and algorithmic decision making, and how that's situated within organisational cultures and organisational values. The second thing that we're doing is to look at how machine learning actually comes into use in the everyday life of the organisation. So rather than seeing it as an abstract set of techniques, or at least a very embedded set of techniques within the data science department, we're looking at what happens when those models are rolled out across the organisation, and they have to be used in different parts of the business. They have to be used by the call centre handler, the call handlers in the call centre, for example. How do those different business users and call handlers understand and explain machine learning, both to themselves as part of the organisation, but also to their customers? And that's a much longer and interesting set of questions that arise from that as to how particularly algorithmic decision-making systems do come into use as part of hybrid forms of practice, particularly in call handling. But that's something I could perhaps answer questions about. The second thing that we do is take a community perspective on explainability. So our aim then is to see what would explainability actually look like for different data publics. Now, I could go into that again, but just to say that what seems like an explanation to a data scientist may not be the same for all people across socioeconomically diverse groups with different concerns, experiences, and knowledge. What we're doing here is taking social divisions and differences seriously to try and understand what would meaningful explainability look like to those different data publics. And we're working on that with two of our partners in Bristol, the Northwest Media Centre, which is situated on the edge of the city in Northwest, if any of you know the city, and the Black Network, to understand how we might create different models of explainability or different ways of thinking about explainability. So this project embodies the principles outlined above. We have an interdisciplinary team. We are embedded within LV, carrying out an organisational ethnography with the data science team and the business areas, and working in collaboration with community groups. What this is going to allow us to do is to move beyond understanding machine learning as a data science method and do three important things. First, open up for reflection the diverse hopes and fears for the future that are invested in machine learning, whether it is by the organisational directors or by community activists or by call centre handlers, to try and understand what do people hope for and fear for in terms of socio-digital futures when they think about and encounter machine learning. And I think if anybody's ever looked at the AI report from the Royal Society about public understandings of AI and thinking about why that matters, I would really, really recommend that. It would show the importance of this to you. The second thing that it allows us to do is analyse what happens when machine learning models come into practice, both organisationally and in communities. So it's to take us back to that point about the web, about how the future tends to surprise us. Technologies don't happen on their own. They happen in their integration with organisational cultures, with consumer behaviours, with beliefs, with values, in particular in concrete settings. And this will help us to understand that. And then third and finally, and perhaps most ambitiously, this is going to allow us to move beyond explaining machine learning to organisational members and communities, and instead learn from organisational members and communities about what it means to them and if and how it might be done differently. So just to conclude, I'm aware that this has been, it's actually been really hard for me to put together this talk, partly because of the speaking into the void thing, but also because I wanted to really give you a very broad overview and flavour of what we want to achieve, both across the sectors and across the disciplines, in long-term sustainable organisational settings. You know, this is not about one project and then another project. This is about creating long-term sustainable relationships that we can do a whole variety of things with our partners, but also give you some concrete detail of a project that we're actually working on that might give you a bit of an understanding of the integration of the sociological and computational expertise that we're working with here, as well as the expertise from our partners and our communities. So I'm going to stop there just to say I hope we can take forward some of these ideas both now, if there's any questions, but also in the future as we work with BT in Bristol Digital Futures Institute over the coming years. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Halford. I do have a couple of questions for you, if you're okay. Yeah? The first one's quite lengthy, so bear with me. It comes from Bob Slay. And he goes, does the future need for interdisciplinary and cross-sectorial collaboration become so pervasive that it actually highlights the need for a structural root and branch revision of the education sector, removing the compartmentalization between industry and academia, as well as between the disciplines and sectors within education?
Wow. Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but I think as a piece of speculative thinking, it would be very, very interesting to consider what that would actually look like. Now, how would we design universities or businesses that did that, that organisationally embodied that kind of transcending of those existing boundaries? So I think it needs innovation. We have to be practical about what that innovation is. And the other thing I would say is we still need in-depth expertise. So this is not about doing away with in-depth expertise. I may work very closely with computer scientists and engineers. I'm never going to be a computer scientist or an engineer at this point in proceedings. What I need to do is to learn enough literacy and competency to ask serious and sensible questions and have serious and sensible conversations with engineers about the topics that we're interested in. And likewise for the engineers who are not likely to become social theorists overnight or to develop in-depth methodological skills from the social scientists. So, yes, I like the question. Yes, I think it's a speculative design. I'm intrigued by it. And I think realistically, we're looking at more pragmatic creation of spaces within the existing structures rather than a root and branch transformation anytime soon.
So could you classify that as tweaking on the edges as compared to a root and branch change?
No, one of the metaphors I quite like that people are using a lot in thinking about interdisciplinarity is also, I don't think it's on the edges, to be honest. I think it has to be in the centre. I think we have the most impact if we're in tweaking in the centre. One of the metaphors that I like is also of trees, but it's about joining up of the canopy across the trunks, if you like. So we still have the trunks of the disciplines or perhaps the sectors, but we build a canopy that sits across those things and enables us to move between them at that higher level.
Okay, so yeah, Bob has come back and says, so more of an overlay than a replacement.
Well, I mean, there's a difference between the speculative and the what's going to happen anytime soon. I think we need overlay, new pathways through, and I think if we create new pathways through, then we will start to change the root and branch anyway. So if we look, for example, at the way in which the education of computer scientists is changing, and the disciplines are not static, they're not written in stone. The training that I had years ago is different from the training that students get now, and I'm sure many of your audience would also feel the same. So I think the interventions that we make, the tweaking at the centre, if you like, will start to change the root and branch as well, but it will be in a more piecemeal way rather than let's throw it all up in the air tomorrow and change it the next day.
Okay. So I have another question from Carol Fletcher. Social scientists and engineers / computer scientists may have a very different view of the world. How easy is it to get them to see things from each other's perspectives?
I just think it depends. It can be incredibly difficult, and I think the key thing is motivation. I think Carol's absolutely right that we're trained in very different ways. We understand the world in different ways. What counts as knowledge, the sorts of questions that we ask are really different. But I think if we go into it with a really, it's for the... It sounds grand, I suppose, but it's for the greater good that we need to go into this with a spirit of collaboration and be willing to listen and learn from each other.
Okay. A question for me, really. You mentioned the whole area of artificial intelligence and the role that it may play in this kind of thing, and there's lots of debates and discussions about AI, machine learning, and its bias. So do you see bias playing a role here? Do you see the bias being taken out, or do you see it actually impacting the work that you're looking at?
Definitely something that we're looking at very closely in our partnership with LV. So that's where they started with this, was with a deep concern for bias and the questions of how they would track and trace, I can't believe I said track and trace, how they would monitor and understand potential biases or actual biases as they evolved, and how they would explain the due diligence and explanation of how they were sure that bias was or wasn't operating in their models. So I think that's really critical. And I think in terms of how communities understand machine learning, this is crucial. And when I go back to thinking about that Royal Society report, that the Royal Society is cognizant of the history of AI and the long history of AI winters and renewed enthusiasm for AI, and cognizant that actually taking the public with engineering developments and taking these questions of bias very seriously is something that is not just a nice moral thing to do, but is actually an important thing to do for the future of AI and the future investment in AI.
Okay, great. And do you have a feeling, is all of this technological change and such, is it changing morality in culture? And I know it's a big question, but as I said to somebody earlier, that I'm a gentleman of a certain age. Things are changing. Things are changing quickly. But
Yeah.
I'm also seeing some moral changes. Is this a technology thing? Is it really impacting social media? Is it impacting human behavior as a consequence, and therefore it will impact the kind of research that you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's dangerous to think that forms of hate speech or bullying or the kinds of things that I assume you're referring to didn't happen before we had social media. I mean, clearly they did, unfortunately. So it's not that the technologies have caused these kinds of practices. I think the difference is scale, speed, and anonymity.
Okay. Yeah, it's personally, I think it's the anonymity that contributes to it probably more than it probably should. So we have one more question here from James Fallon. He said, in light of climate science research, such as IPCC report on 1.5 degrees, we know that there is a need for rapid transition towards economies that prioritize human well-being, sustainability, and for rapid decarbonization instead of growth. What will this mean for tech futures?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think we're not, there's increasing interest in this now. We probably 5 years ago, in my world at least, the world of academic research, there was a great optimism about how digital platforms of one sort or another, or digital monitoring, or devices or interventions of one kind or another would be the solution somehow. You tell people how much hot water they were using and they go, oh, and then they'd stop doing it, and that would be part of the solution to the climate crisis. I think we've moved pretty much beyond that now to think about the implication of digital technologies in creating the climate crisis, as well as being part of the solution. So I think absolutely there needs to be far more routine consideration of that question, and it needs to be informed by social practices as well. So how do people use technologies? How might they use them differently? What would it mean to ask people to consume less or consume resources differently online or whatever? So people have said in the COVID crisis, oh, everybody's shopping online. That's great because it's reducing traffic in our city centres. But obviously that doesn't take very long until we start thinking about what it's doing to delivery traffic or what it's doing to online traffic. So I think a joined up picture is really needed to address that question. Okay,
great. Thank you very much. I've got no more questions now, so I'll start to bring this session to a close. But once again, it's one of these topics I think that we could probably discuss for hours on end, to be honest, because it's one of these really big societal changes. I loved your analogy at the beginning about the pandemic being a portal and such. I have a 22-year-old daughter. You can imagine our views don't always coincide, and I keep trying to tell her it could be worse. But I love the portal analogy. I think that's something I'll be using in the future.
Good.
Great.
Thank you.
So Professor Halford, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And right, so I'd like to start to bring this session to a close. I'd like to invite back in Carol Fletcher as we start to bring the 3 days of Tommy Flowers to a close. And I just want to make a few kind of observations of some of the topics and things we've covered over the last 3 days. It's been fairly far-reaching. I mean, collaboration was kind of a theme that ran throughout the whole 3 days, whether it's with academia, whether it's with business, whether it's with government and such. But I think the key message here is there needs to be more collaboration, even within the academic space where, you know, I'm a geologist, therefore I don't want to go talk to the sociologist or don't want to go talk to the other scientists and such. I think there needs to be more of that as we go cross-disciplinary. And obviously industry and business and government plays a big role. Lots of discussions around artificial intelligence, machine learning, what that may mean, how it can be used, the benefits of it, also the possible downsides of it as that technology develops as well. But the two key things that come out for me is one is skills. There's a whole other range of skill sets that need to be developed that probably aren't quite there yet. I've been saying now for maybe 10 years that the school children of today are being trained into jobs they don't even know existed yet. So how can we train them in the right kind of way at this stage? So it's got to be a more dynamic structure from that perspective, from primary all the way through as well. And then the last thing is about creating value. And that doesn't mean necessarily just making more money. This is about how does it benefit society in a wider context other than just growth in the society as well. Does it impact, you know, as I asked Professor Halford, does it impact our morality in some way as well? So lots of different things to consider, lots of different things to think about with that. And hopefully it's given you guys something to actually think about as well. So Carol, any final comments from you?
Thanks, Mike. That was a really super wrap up. Just to say, if you've missed anything over the course of the 3 days, or you'd like to listen again, all of the content will be going live on our YouTube channel in the next few days. Just want to take a quick look ahead to our next conferences. So our next conference will be the week of the 21st of June. And for that, we're going to be another virtual conference like this one, and we're going to be looking at Industry 4.0 and smart connected manufacturing. So lots of interesting challenges and interesting discussions to be had around that. And then our next conference after that, which we hope we might be able to have some face-to-face elements, so perhaps a hybrid virtual and in-person conference in the autumn, will be on AI and data science. So just to kind of close the conference, I just want to say an enormous thank you to everyone who's taken part in whatever way, whether that's been as a presenter, a panelist, a host, the great Tommy Flowers team behind the scenes who have made this happen, Quatreus who have made the magic happen so that this has been streamed all seamlessly to you. I would say an enormous thank you, and I hope that you have a great weekend when it comes.
Great. Thank you very much. Everybody take care.
Bye.